Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 231 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading covers Ezekiel chapter 14 through 16, and for my commentary, I'm primarily going to be looking at a few verses out of chapter 14. Now, in this, the Lord is telling Ezekiel that even though these elders who are in exile with him, these are not the same as the elders who we've already addressed in a previous study, those who have been left behind in Jerusalem and Judea. These are ones that were taken away into exile. And the Lord is going to address with Ezekiel that these men think of themselves as having arrived. They have a haughty attitude, or rather, they're hypocrites. They are looking back and saying, look at what God's doing to these who are back in Jerusalem, and look at how they worship these idols and how God's judgment is coming upon them for having done this act. And yet the Lord is going to reveal to Ezekiel that these men, even though they don't have physical idols of stone or wood or gold, they have set up idols still in their heart. And, this is a sad thing that we still see in our society today, a sad thing that we still see in the church. I oftentimes refer to it as misplaced priorities, where people are focused on things other than their service to the Lord. And some of these things are innocent if they're done in proportion, but whenever they take away from the Lord and your service to Him, or even when they take away from your family's time of worship and study and learning of the Lord, that then becomes an idol. And to use an example, and I know I'll step on toes just barely mentioning these examples, but sports become such an idol to people. And right now, if you were somebody bothered by when I said sports, maybe it's an idol in your life. I just want to challenge you with that thought. Or, as a friend pointed out just this evening, hunting can be that obstacle or that God that some people have set up. Now, and again, I know maybe you just heard me say that and you're like, ouch, well, no, I don't agree with that, and you became defensive. Well, if that was the case, then maybe that has become an idol to you. For others, it could be their sports car. It could be a number of different things. Whenever there is something that takes such priority in your life that you neglect the Word of God, you neglect fellowship with other believers, you neglect your time of prayer, in some cases people neglect their families, then those things have become idols in your life. A family can even become an idol. I know of people who they will make excuses as to not going to church because not all of their family will go to church. Now, I'm not speaking here of a teenager or a child who doesn't want to go. That should not really be an option. And that needs to be something that the parents address and say, no, we as a family are going. Once you become an adult, what you do after that, it's going to be up to you, between you and God. I'm just giving these as examples because they are real life examples. But the best thing you can do is evaluate your life and ask God to search me. Say, Lord, search my heart. Show me the things in my life that have come before you, the things that are hindering my worship of you. Now, I'm just going to say, and this has been something that I've been preaching recently, we live at a time of ever-increasing darkness. I can ask this. I've asked this recently at a few churches. I'll say, how many of you believe that the times that we are in are increasingly dark compared to what you even saw 3 or 4 years ago? And everybody in the congregation will raise their hand. What I would like to do then is to follow that up by saying, how many of you are praying more? How many of you are reading the Bible more? And now here's where it really gets tough. How many of you are witnessing more? This applies to everybody watching this video. How many people have you shared the gospel with this past week? I don't mean by your lifestyle. I don't mean by the way that you went to the mailbox and opened it up and had a smile on your face, thinking that maybe the neighbor that lives across from you is going to say, well, I know they're getting bills because I'm getting bills, but they're always happy. I want to know what makes them happy. That's in a movie. That doesn't really happen like that. We need to go out and witness and share the gospel with people. Now you're saying, how does this pertain to Ezekiel? Well, because these people had set obstacles between them and God. They had been taken away in exile, but it's sort of like the church member that they see themselves as better than those in the world, but they don't realize that they still have the idols in their heart. Maybe they don't have the stone, the metal, or the wooden idol in their hand, but they still have it in their heart. And that's exactly what God was telling Ezekiel, that these men have not yet fully surrendered to the Lord. And yet they're thinking, well, if we were back in Jerusalem, God wouldn't bring judgment upon the city like he is now, because if we were there, things would be different. Well, listen to this where the Lord addresses that mindset. And I'm going to start in verse 13 of Ezekiel chapter 14. Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, cut it off from both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. Now, we read this and you're thinking, Noah, Daniel, Job, you're thinking, yes, these were men of prayer. These were men of action. These were great men of faith. But I want you to put on the brakes for just a second. Because Daniel, of the three, he's still alive. He, at the time that this was, I'm not meaning alive now, I mean at the time of this being written, or the Lord saying this to Ezekiel, Daniel was with them in exile. Now, of course, Daniel was taken away in the first group being taken away into exile. Ezekiel was taken away in the second group. So they knew Daniel. Daniel wasn't just a Bible figure of days of old. He was a Bible figure living among them. And it speaks volumes to say what Daniel's righteousness was like, what his prayer life was like. It's one thing for us to look back at somebody of the days of old and speak of their righteousness. But Daniel was standing right there in exile with them. And yet the testimony of his life that he was living for God spoke very clearly to the people of that day. What though was a message that God was saying to them? He was telling them they were thinking of themselves more highly than they should, because he's telling them, you think that if you were back in the promised land, if you were back in Jerusalem, if you were back in Judea, if you were back in Israel, that God wouldn't be sending this judgment because your righteousness would be so great that the Lord would say, well, I'm not going to harm those people. But the whole time in your heart, there's wickedness. I really think that this chapter is one that the people today, God's people, need to consider. We need to consider where we stand in these dark days. And as I say, there's no doubt that the time period that we live in is very dark. And it's only going to get darker. And I shared this with a group of people just this evening, in that we may be just a pin light in the darkness. But even in the darkest of places, and I used to do a lot of spelunking, a lot of caving in my youth, and it was always amazing to go into the depths of a cave and turn off every light that you had. Cover up even your watch if it was one that would glow. Every single light being completely extinguished. And then light a single match. And the brightness of that single match, once it's lit in the utter darkness, is overwhelming. It's blinding, even though it was just a small little match. So, as the days get darker that we are living in today, your light, the light of Christ rather, shining through you is needed that much more. And you may feel like I'm not putting out a bright light, but even the dimmest light is like the sun when it's in the midst of the darkness that surrounds us today. Brothers and sisters, please get out and witness and share with people today. People are dying and perishing because no one is out telling them the gospel truth, and that needs to be told. I hope that your day goes well. I hope that you've had a good day today. Until tomorrow, God bless.